Taking the night shift at the radio station felt like a lifeline. Bills were overdue, and my last gig had ended abruptly after the company downsized. So when I saw the ad, overnight radio operator needed, no experience required, high pay, I didn't think twice before applying. The station was in the middle of nowhere, nestled on the outskirts of a small town. When I arrived, the building loomed like a relic from another era. Its brick facade was cracked, and the neon sign above the door flickered faintly, spelling out WXR 87. The parking lot was empty, except for a single battered sedan, and the air smelled faintly of ozone. Inside, the atmosphere was no less unsettling. The walls were lined with outdated posters, and the equipment looked like it hadn't been upgraded in decades. A single desk lamp cast long shadows across the room, making the small space feel cavernous. "Good, you're here." The voice startled me. A man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard stepped into view, holding a clipboard. He looked me up and down, his expression unreadable. "I'm Dave, your supervisor. Let's make this quick." He handed me a piece of paper. At first glance, it looked like a standard orientation checklist, but as I read, my stomach tightened. Rules for the night shift. Never answer the phone after 3 a.m. If you hear static from the radios, shut them off immediately. Do not look out the window between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Keep the music playing at all times. If you hear your name over the airwaves, ignore it. I laughed nervously, expecting Dave to crack a smile or offer some explanation. He didn't. "These are serious," he said, his tone flat. "Follow them and you'll be fine." "Are you messing with me?" I asked, holding up the paper. "What is this? Some kind of hazing?" Dave's eyes darkened. "No questions. Just follow the rules." Before I could press further, he pointed toward the control room. "Your shift starts now. I'll lock up when I leave. You'll be alone until 6 a.m. The control room was cramped, filled with rows of outdated equipment. A large window overlooked the empty parking lot, and the faint hum of static filled the air. I sat down at the console, fiddling with the dials as Dave disappeared into the night. At first, it was easy. I loaded a playlist into the system, and the music began to play softly over the speakers. The hum of static faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of classic rock. For the first couple of hours, nothing happened. I scrolled through my phone, occasionally glancing at the console to make sure everything was running smoothly. But as the clock crept toward midnight, the station began to change. The air grew colder, the hum of the equipment louder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rules sat on the desk beside me, glaring up like a warning. By midnight, the station felt alive. Not in a comforting way, but like it was watching me. The hum of the equipment had taken on an almost rhythmic quality, as though it were breathing. I shook off the thought and focused on the console, keeping the music playlist running smoothly. The rules sat on the desk, like a silent taunt, daring me to question their purpose. It started with the static. At first, it was faint, a barely noticeable hiss underneath the music. I adjusted the volume, thinking it was just interference. But as the clock ticked past 12:30 a.m., the static grew louder, cutting through the music like an intruder. My pulse quickened, the rules flashing in my mind. If you hear static from the radios, shut them off immediately. I hesitated. The console was a maze of switches and knobs, and I wasn't sure which one controlled the offending signal. The static intensified, a harsh, grating noise that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I scrambled to turn off the main switch, and the room plunged into silence. The sudden quiet was almost worse. My ears rang, and for a moment, I thought I heard voices, faint and distant, like a whisper just out of reach. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination. Still, I couldn't ignore the creeping unease that settled over me. I restarted the system, the music returning to the airwaves. The clock on the wall ticked softly, its hands moving impossibly slow. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling aimlessly, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. My eyes kept drifting to the window. Rule 3. Do not look out the window between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. It wasn't even close to 2 a.m. yet, but the urge to glance outside was overwhelming. The parking lot was empty when I arrived. There was no reason for anyone to be out there, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was. I forced myself to stay seated, gripping the armrests of the chair until my knuckles turned white. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, like a branch brushing against the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time, a deliberate rhythm that sent chills down my spine. Do not look out the window. The rule echoed in my mind, a lifeline tethering me to sanity. I stayed rooted to the chair, every muscle in my body screaming at me to check. What if it was Dave? What if something was wrong? Don't, I whispered to myself, clutching the edge of the desk. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. The clock read 1:45 a.m. 15 more minutes until the danger zone. I forced myself to focus on the console, checking the playlist and adjusting the volume levels. But my hands trembled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was outside hadn't left. At 2 a.m., the knocking started again. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was outside knew the clock had struck 2 a.m. I clenched my jaw, trying to ignore it, but the sound was impossible to block out. It wasn't just knocking, it was a deliberate rhythm, almost musical, yet disturbingly offbeat. I glanced at the rules on the desk, the words glaring up at me like a dare. Do not look out the window between 2 and 4 a.m. My breathing grew shallow as I stared at the glass, the temptation clawing at me. What if it was someone who needed help? What if it was Dave? Or worse, what if ignoring it was breaking a rule I hadn't been told? The knocking stopped. For a brief moment, the silence felt like a reprieve. I took a deep breath, steadying myself, and reached for my phone to distract from the gnawing fear. That's when I heard it. My name. It came from the radio speakers. Faint at first, then louder, clearer, as though whispered by someone standing right next to me. James. I froze. Rule 5. If you hear your name over the airwaves, ignore it. James, the voice repeated, soft and coaxing. It wasn't just any voice, it was mine. My heart hammered in my chest as the voice continued, echoing through the small room like a taunt. James, look outside. You need to see this. Panic seized me. My name shouldn't have been broadcast. It wasn't possible. I scrambled to shut off the speakers, my hands fumbling with the dials. The voice cut out abruptly, replaced by a low, static hum that seemed to seep into my bones. Then I heard the knock again, this time accompanied by a scrape, like nails dragging across the glass. I couldn't take it anymore. The rules be damned. I had to know what was out there. My hands shook as I stood, every muscle screaming in protest, and turned toward the window. The parking lot was empty. I let out a choky breath, relief washing over me. I must have been imagining it. The stress, the isolation. It was all playing tricks on my mind. But as I turned back to the desk, movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the station's flickering floodlight, was a figure. It stood motionless, shrouded in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. My breath hitched as it took a step forward, then another, its movements slow and deliberate. Its head tilted, and for a fleeting moment, the light caught its face. No, not a face. It was blank, smooth, as though someone had erased every feature. The sight made my stomach churn, and I stumbled back, knocking over the chair. The figure stopped abruptly, its head tilting again as though it was listening. Then it turned sharply and disappeared into the darkness. I backed away from the window, my legs trembling, and collapsed into the chair. The rules weren't suggestions. They were protection. I had broken one, and now something knew I was here. The knocking resumed, louder than ever, and this time it came from inside the building. The knocking echoed through the station, sharp and deliberate, reverberating off the walls. My mind raced as I stared at the door to the hallway, the source of the sound unmistakable. Whatever had been outside wasn't there anymore. It was inside. I grabbed the wrench I had tucked into my bag, clutching it tightly as I rose from the chair. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the hallway, the beam trembling along with my hands. The rules flashed in my mind, each one a lifeline I had already begun to throw. "Stick to the rules," I whispered to myself, as if saying it out loud would ward off whatever was coming. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Then came a new sound, static. It wasn't from the speakers or the control panel. It was coming from deeper inside the building, an unnatural hum that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. I stepped toward the hallway, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the tiled floor. The air grew colder as I moved, the static pulling me forward like a beacon. The door to the break room was ajar, faint light spilling out into the dark corridor. I hesitated, gripping the wrench tighter. "James." The voice came again, this time from the break room. My name echoed softly, followed by a faint chuckle that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't just my voice anymore. It was layered, distorted, as though multiple people were speaking at once. The rules screamed in my mind. If you hear your name over the airwaves, ignore it. But this wasn't over the airwaves. Did the rule still apply? I pushed the door open slowly, the crack loud enough to make my heart skip a beat. The break room was empty, the table cluttered with old coffee mugs and paperwork. But in the corner, the radio sat on a shelf, crackling softly with static. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The radio wasn't even plugged in. My stomach churned as I reached for the power dial, the static growing louder as my fingers brushed against it. "Don't," a voice whispered, so close it felt like someone was breathing down my neck. I spun around, the flashlight beam darting across the room, but there was no one there. My chest tightened, the weight of the air pressing down on me. The static stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so absolute it felt unnatural. Then came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, they echoed down the hallway toward me. My flashlight flickered as I stepped back, my eyes locked on the doorway. The footsteps stopped just outside, and a shadow stretched across the threshold. "James," the voice called again, now from the doorway. The shadow didn't move, but its presence filled the room like a tangible force. My mind raced as I remembered the final rule. If anything moves, leave immediately. I bolted, wrench in hand, sprinting past the shadow and into the hallway. The footsteps followed, faster now, pounding against the floor in time with my heartbeat. I reached the control room and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. The pounding on the door was immediate, each impact shaking the walls. My flashlight flickered again, the beam barely holding as I backed into the console. The music on the speakers faltered, replaced by the same static that had haunted me all night. Then, through the static, I heard it again. My name, repeated over and over, distorted and mocking. The pounding stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the static, low and constant. Then, from the speakers, the voice whispered, "You broke the rules, James. Now it's time to pay." The lights flickered, and the door creaked open slowly, as though inviting me to see what was waiting. The door opened with an agonizing slowness, revealing the dark hallway beyond. My flashlight sputtered and went out entirely, leaving the faint glow of the control panel as my only source of light. My breathing was ragged, every shallow inhale echoing in the oppressive silence. Then it stepped inside. The shadowy figure I had glimpsed earlier now stood in the doorway, its blank face tilting as if studying me. Its body moved unnaturally, each step jerky and stilted, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. The air around it felt heavy, colder than the rest of the room, as though it was sucking all the warmth from the space. I clutched the wrench tightly, but it felt useless in my hand. What could I possibly do against something like this? My mind scrambled for answers, and then I remembered. The rules. They had to mean something. They weren't just arbitrary commands. They were the only thing keeping me alive. "You don't belong here," the figure said, its voice a distorted mimicry of mine. The sound was wrong, layered with tones that didn't belong to a human throat. The rules flashed in my mind like a mantra. Never answer the phone after 3 a.m. If you hear static, shut it off. Do not look out the window. One by one, I ticked through them, trying to find something I hadn't yet broken. My name had been called. The static had lingered. I had looked out the window. How many mistakes had I made? The figure took another step closer, its movements more fluid now, as though it was growing stronger. The static on the speakers grew louder, morphing into a high-pitched whine that made my ears ring. I stumbled back, bumping into the console, my eyes darting to the clock. 3 a.m. exactly. The phone on the desk rang, the shrill tone slicing through the chaos. My heart dropped as I stared at it, the rule flashing like a warning. Never answer the phone after 3 a.m. I reached out instinctively, but stopped myself at the last second, my hand hovering over the receiver. The figure laughed, a guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Answer it, James," it said, its head tilting sharply. "It's for you." I clenched my fist, fighting the overwhelming urge to pick up the phone. Instead, I slammed my hand down on the console, cutting the power to the speakers. The room plunged into silence, but the figure didn't falter. "You've already broken the rules," it hissed. "What's one more?" Its form shifted, growing taller, darker, its blank face stretching into something that resembled a grin. My grip on the wrench tightened as I backed toward the corner of the room, every instinct screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. Then I saw it. In the corner of the desk, beneath a pile of papers, was a journal. Its leather cover was cracked with age, the edges worn and frayed. I grabbed it without thinking, flipping it open to the first page. The handwriting was frantic, scrawled in uneven lines. "The rules are your only defense, but if you break them, you must make it right." "What does that mean?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The figure stopped, its head tilting as though it had heard me. The room grew colder, the shadows around it writhing like living things. I flipped through the journal, scanning the pages for answers. "Sacrifice is the key." The words were underlined, circled repeatedly. My stomach dropped as the meaning became clear. The rules weren't just there to protect me. They were there to contain something. And now, I had let it out. The phone rang again, louder this time, and I knew what I had to do. I reached for the receiver, ignoring the figure's mocking laughter. My hand trembled as I lifted it to my ear. "Hello?" I whispered. The voice on the other end was my own. "You've made a mistake," it said, "but there's still time to fix it." The line went dead, and when I turned, the figure was gone. The figure was gone, but the room was suffocatingly still. The phone's dial tone hummed faintly before clicking off, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. My flashlight flickered back to life, its weak beam illuminating the room in trembling shadows. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel free. Whatever I'd done, I had only delayed the inevitable. The journal was still in my hands. Its pages felt heavier now, almost alive, as I flipped through them again. The words blurred together in chaotic scrawls, but one line stood out, bold and sharp. To contain it, someone must stop. My chest tightened as the meaning sunk in. The rules were never meant to protect me. They were meant to trap whatever this thing was. And when I broke them, I loosened its grip on this place. Now, the only way to keep it contained was to take responsibility. I glanced at the clock. 5:15 a.m. Dawn was close, but not close enough. The rules had kept the entity bound to this place, and without them, it would roam free, unless someone stayed to maintain the cycle. My heart sank as I realized there was no other way. I reached for the microphone on the console, my hands trembling. The static had cleared, replaced by the faint hum of music still playing in the background. With a deep breath, I pressed the button to go live. "This is James," I said, my voice cracking. "If anyone's listening, know this. The rules are not just rules. They're the only thing keeping this place, and whatever's inside it, from spreading. If you find yourself working here, follow them exactly. And if you break them..." I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The entity had retreated for now, but I could feel its presence lingering, waiting. My shift would end at 6 a.m., but the knowledge of what I'd unleashed would stay with me forever. At 5:45 a.m., the phone rang again. I didn't hesitate this time. I picked it up, the receiver cold against my ear. "What now?" I asked, my voice hoarse. There was no answer, just the faint sound of static, and then my own voice, distorted and broken. "It's not over." I slammed the phone down, the words ringing in my ears. The clock ticked steadily towards 6 a.m., each second dragging on like an eternity. I gathered my things, including the journal, and stood by the door, ready to leave the moment my shift ended. When the clock struck 6 o'clock, the air seemed to lighten. The oppressive weight that had filled the station lifted slightly, though the shadows remained long and dark. I opened the door and stepped into the cool morning air, the sunrise casting a pale glow over the empty parking lot. Dave's car pulled in moments later, his face unreadable as he got out. He approached me slowly, his gaze flicking to the journal in my hand. "You made it," he said, his tone flat. "Barely," I replied, holding up the journal. "What is this place? What's in there?" Dave didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at the station, his expression grim. "You'll figure it out eventually," he said. "We all do." As I walked to my car, I noticed another figure standing by the entrance. Young, nervous, clutching a backpack, the next hire. Dave handed them a clipboard, and even from a distance, I recognized the list of rules. The cycle was starting again,